are live now. Okay, well, welcome everybody to New England chapter of SPJNE. We're hosting an event tonight with Greg Stohr. He's a Harvard Law graduate, clerked for U.S. Judge Frank A. Kaufman in Baltimore, and joined Bloomberg in 1998. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for making time for us. So tell us about the news today. I mean, was there any news from the Supreme Court?
It wasn't big news. They issued a couple of opinions in relatively low-profile cases. They agreed to hear one new case. They took a couple cases off the argument calendar as expected. These were cases involving Trump-era immigration policies, one having to do with spending on the border wall, one having to do with making asylum applicants stay in Mexico while their applications are being processed. Those are cases that the Biden administration has signaled it's going to change the policies so that the administration asked the court to take those off the argument calendar, and the court agreed to do that. So it was kind of a weird day in that this is not usually a time of year when the court does stuff like this, and we were all kind of wondering whether they were going to do something more momentous, but it ended up being just kind of routine stuff.
And from my understanding, they don't meet for another like 20 days. Is that right?
Yeah, February 22nd, I believe, is the next day they take the virtual bench. Usually this is a period where they call it the midwinter break. It's 4 weeks where we don't really hear from them. Sometimes they travel, do other stuff. And I think what's happening is that because it used to be that pre-pandemic, the court, when it issued opinions, always issued them from the bench. And obviously they're not taking the bench now, so they're just issuing them by posting them online. And since they're doing that, they figure, well, you know, the 4-week break doesn't really mean anything, so we might as well just put them out when they're ready.
So if you don't mind me asking you, what are you going to be doing during that time?
It's a good question. You know, normally there's a certain amount of preparation. There's a big part of this job is getting ready for the court to do things. So cases that they argued previously, I know they're going to decide between now and the end of June. There's, you know, getting ready for those decisions, and I usually concoct a couple different versions of stories that I'm going to write. In a normal year, I might also look ahead to a case that's being argued in March or April and say, oh, maybe I'll fly out to, you know, maybe pick a warm place where there's a litigant who's got a case at the Supreme Court. And then there's some other things that one might normally do. There's a little conference they have out at Stanford this time of year that I've gone to from time to time on the Supreme Court. And mostly I'm just going to, you know, be looking to write enterprise stories, you know, maybe think about, you know, the intersection of the Biden administration and a conservative Supreme Court, maybe think about, you know, the prospect of Stephen Breyer retiring this year, things like that.
Yeah, so you mentioned a new administration, a new court. Can you describe what the court looks like now that Trump has appointed 3 of the justices? What are we going to expect to see for generations to come?
Well, it's, you know, the most conservative court, certainly in my lifetime. I'm not sure how far you'd have to go back, but it's going to be fascinating. And I am confident that over the next 4 years, we're going to have a lot of occasions where the Biden administration is fighting an uphill battle in the courts, maybe, you know, having to deal with administrative actions. We've already seen a federal judge block the president's moratorium on deportations. That case could work its way up the court system pretty quickly. You know, there's going to be, you know, just like during the Trump era, we had the administration issuing executive orders and rules and regulations, and those being challenged in court. We're going to see the same thing with the Biden administration, only with probably a much more skeptical court.
Yeah, so you mentioned the conservative court. So there's this perception that the court is partisan. Do you agree with that? And if so, what can we do to fix it as journalists? Do you think we need to fix it as journalists, the view of the court?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, partisan is kind of a loaded word, but it's clearly the case that, and has been for the last few years, that we now have a phenomenon that the most conservative justices are all the Republican appointees and the most liberal justices are all the Democratic appointees. That hasn't been the case historically, but it has been for the last decade or so. It really remains to be seen how this court operates with this 6-3 conservative majority. So what we've had for the last year or so is John Roberts, who is generally a pretty conservative guy, putting the brakes on the conservative instincts of some of his colleagues and almost as operating as a one-man check on Donald Trump and his administration when they tried to cut some corners, didn't go through the proper procedures to do things like ending the DACA deferred deportation program. But now Roberts is no longer the swing justice. He's no longer the justice in control. And so I don't yet know. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens when maybe it's Brett Kavanaugh in a particular case who's deciding how far the court's going to go. Or maybe, in some cases it's Neil Gorsuch or even Amy Coney Barrett. It may take a little while for it to be clear how this court's gonna operate. And then you have all the questions about like how quickly will they move to overturn precedents like Roe v. Wade or gay rights precedents or there's all manner of things. And I think it's going to be a work in progress. I tend to think that Brett Kavanaugh will be the single most important justice going forward, but that's remains to be seen.
So I guess the other question I had was, do you think that journalists have to make sure people know what the Supreme Court is now? Because again, I think they might perceive it as just a completely partisan thing, right?
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I didn't answer that part of your question. It is. I am somebody who, for a long time, has felt like I should identify justices as being Republican appointed or Democratic appointed. The justices don't like that. John Roberts likes to say we're not Republicans or Democrats up here. Well, okay, but I think it tells the reader something to know, especially in an ideologically divided case, whichever way a justice goes or a lower court judge. I think it tells the reader something to know, who the party was who appointed or who the president was who appointed the judge. It's the court with Amy Coney Barrett hasn't done a whole lot yet. So, what I'm saying when I talk about it being the most conservative court of my lifetime, that's what I'm expecting. They haven't proven themselves to be that yet. They might prove themselves that way. And then it will very much be incumbent on journalists to, really underscore how much change we're talking about. And I'm already thinking, even in the way I've described the court here, I described the conservatives and the liberals, and that was accurate in a relative standpoint, but the conservative justices now are much more conservative than conservative justices of 50 years ago, and certainly the liberal justices on the court are a lot less liberal than the justices like Thurgood Marshall and William Brennan and Harry Blackmun that were on the court a few decades ago. And so, one thing I think we all need to find ways to do is to let people know that just because we call Stephen Breyer a liberal does not mean that he is liberal in the way some people think of it, as in he's not out there trying to create new rights under the Constitution and things like that. It will be a challenge. It will be a challenge that's made easier to the extent the court takes up a whole bunch of ideologically divisive cases and starts overturning precedents like Roe v. Wade.
See, when I think about the Supreme Court and how conservative it is, I think about like the Federalist Society and kind of like Donald Trump used that list to handpick
Mhm.
nominees. I mean, is there a Federalist Society version of on the liberal side, or is that something that's just completely unique to the Republicans?
No, there is, but it is not nearly as powerful. It doesn't. It's called the American Constitution Society. It was essentially set up to be the Federalist Society of the left. They have programs like the Federalist Society does. They try to foster discussion among legal people who are to the left of center. But they just don't have nearly the influence. And at least up until now, one thing we saw under Donald Trump was that the judges who were appointed to the federal bench were they weren't carbon copies of each other, but they were uniformly, to oversimplify, conservative. They agreed on some pretty basic legal philosophies, like interpreting the Constitution according to its original meaning, or the meaning of the words at the time they were adopted, interpreting federal statutes strictly according to their text. There is not that sort of uniformity around basic legal principles on the left. Nothing that has become almost a prerequisite for somebody to join the bench. We'll see. That may change. I mean, the Biden administration every appearance is going to make judicial nominations a much higher priority than the Obama administration did. So, we'll see whether the types of judges are, I guess, as aggressive as the effort to put numbers on the courts.
So I forgot to mention, whoever's watching, please feel free to type in some questions. We have our first question I'm going to get to soon. I just have one more before I get to that. So we heard the term court packing. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is? Is that term accurate? And is there a possibility that will happen under the Biden administration?
Well, I guess it's accurate, but it's also loaded, because the court packing episode that everybody thinks about was kind of a ham-handed effort by Franklin Roosevelt to add seats to the Supreme Court under the guise of, the justices are getting too old and they can't handle the workload, so we need to help them out. But it was clearly being done for ideological reasons, because the court was striking down parts of the New Deal, and the proposal didn't go anywhere. It got a lot of pushback, among other places, from the court and from Congress. So fast forward to today. I mean, there was a lot of talk about adding seats to the Supreme Court. The Biden proposal to create a commission, which we already have a few names of people who are apparently going to be on the commission, took a little bit of the steam out of it. I mean, the truth is, Democrats just don't have the votes to do that right now. Even if they eliminated the filibuster in the Senate, they're not going to have a majority to add seats to the Supreme Court. Now, that being said, well, first of all, there are other things that might be potentially more doable, smaller scale proposals, and the court itself could change the conversation. I've always kind of thought that, at least from John Roberts' perspective, one of the side benefits of not of pushing back against Trump, especially in the last term, was that it took a little bit of the steam out of this effort to add seats to the Supreme Court. Because it didn't, if the Supreme Court had, let's just say, so there's an abortion case that they have delayed acting on for months. It's a Mississippi case that would ban abortions, virtually all abortions, after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Clearly can't be squared with Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Well, the court, for reasons unknown, has waited for months to act on that case. We still don't know if they're going to take it. If we had seen the court aggressively move to take up that case, hear arguments this term, and potentially have a ruling by June that would really roll back Roe v. Wade, well, then I think, these calls to add seats to the Supreme Court would get a whole lot more momentum. So far, it's been a relatively incremental court, and we'll see what happens going forward. But, for now, it's an interesting discussion point. It doesn't seem like it's, realistically going to happen anytime soon.
So our first question from the audience from Israel, saying, how do you see First Amendment issues playing out with the court in future cases?
It's an interesting question. The conservatives have at least the speech clause. So the question was the First Amendment, and I assume it's mostly thinking about the speech right, although the First Amendment also includes religious rights. But it's become very much a tool of conservatives to accomplish goals like striking down campaign finance regulations. It didn't used to be that way. It's, if we, now I'm, forgive me, I'm probably getting the details of this wrong, but we did see Justice Thomas, and I think only Justice Thomas, suggest he wanted to reconsider the New York Times versus Sullivan decision, which is sort of the basic, the core protection for journalists from defamation suits. And so there was an instance where perhaps the most conservative justice was potentially interested in undermining First Amendment protections or speech protections for the media. It's there are a lot of different facets to it, so it's a little hard to say which way I see it going. It is certainly an area worth watching, if only because the conservatives, for the most part, at least in the non-New York Times versus Sullivan context, have been big fans of it.
So right now we're kind of in this interesting spot where we're doing we're looking at a second impeachment of a president. So I wanted to ask you first off, is it constitutional to impeach a president after he's left office? And why isn't Justice Roberts overseeing this process?
So on the first question, there's not a clear answer, but the weight of authority seems to be on the side of yes, it's perfectly constitutional, or at least that's been the historic practice. Not a lot of it, but all all the cases we have, including one vote that the Senate took back in the 19th century, have indicated that at least the Senate thinks it has the continuing authority to try a former official after he or she has left office. Even if that's wrong, I think one kind of key point is this is probably not an issue that the courts, including the Supreme Court, would ever want to decide. So if Donald Trump wants to sue to say I can't be convicted because I'm a former official, it's entirely possible the Supreme Court would say that is a political question that's up to the Senate or Congress to decide, and we don't have any role to play on this issue. And that's even before you get to the substantive question of whether the Senate is right that it has the authority. In terms of overseeing the trial, the Constitution just says the Chief Justice shall preside when the president has been impeached. It doesn't say anything about the former president. And with that issue, there's even less of a history to go on. But again, the weight of the authority seems to be that it's perfectly fine not to have the president, not to have the Chief Justice presiding over the trial. And the reason for that is that the whole point of a lot of scholars, pretty much every scholar I've talked to or traded messages with, seems to think that the whole point of having the Chief Justice there when the president is on trial is so that the vice president, who might otherwise be the one presiding, isn't faced with this conflict of interest where he or she is presiding over the trial, and if it goes a certain way, might end up being president. That conflict of interest obviously isn't there when you have a former president. So, that's argues that the Chief Justice doesn't have to be there. And then finally, the fact that he's not probably suggests that he agrees with that analysis. If he really thought the Constitution required him to be there, he would probably be there.
Well, I guess I kind of find it a little confusing. So, because we see we saw Roberts playing a role last time. So people might see this as a completely like role for the Supreme Court to play a part in impeachments. But to me, it seems like from what I'm getting, if correct me if I'm wrong, it's a partisan thing, is it not? Political thing, is it not?
I'm sorry, ask the last part of the question again.
Oh, just the act of impeaching a president it seems to be more of a partisan move than a legal or Supreme Court situation, right?
Yeah. So I mean, Roberts there a year ago lended a certain amount of gravitas to it. He didn't really have to do he did very little. In fact, the biggest thing he did was to say, I don't break ties up here. I have no substantive role. But it felt like a trial because it's what we've come to expect when somebody's on trial. There's somebody up there in a robe who, acts like a judge. And now we're going to have, a Democratic senator who's already said that he thinks that that Trump ought to be convicted. And just that is going to give it a more, in my view, certainly is going to give it a more partisan feel. Now, we also have a few Republican senators who have suggested they, might be willing to vote for conviction. So, maybe that will make it slightly less partisan. But just, the nature of having Democrats running the show, including in that, sitting up there in that big chair, will probably take away some of the even-handed feel of the proceedings.
So as a Supreme Court reporter for Bloomberg News, do you cover the impeachment stuff at all? Do you write articles about impeachment stuff?
I've done a little bit. I try to stay in my lane, which is things having to do with justices. And so, I wrote a little bit when Roberts presided a year ago. I've written a little bit about his decision not to preside this year. And I'll write about so I wrote a story on the legal question of whether a former president can be impeached and tried, legal issues that, could make their way up to the Supreme Court. But in terms of the main event of, the case against Trump and his defense and things like that, we have really good congressional reporters, and I'll let them take the lead.
All right, so I have a couple more questions coming in. Thank you, audience, for that. First one we have is, how would you describe each justice in one word?
Well, I have to do one word for each justice? Holy cow.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
That's a tough question.
Maybe start with the newer one.
Well, Barrett, I don't know anything more about than the rest of you. I haven't met her, and I look forward to it at some point. It's it's a strange situation where, and my understanding is she hasn't spent a whole lot of time with a lot of her colleagues either, just because they're not there in the same way they normally would be. How do let me sort of go a slightly different direction and say that some of them are, I have better relationships with other, I know them a lot better and are easier to talk to. I'll say this. I mean, so Kavanaugh is somebody who people have very strong feelings about because of the confirmation process. He is, one of the easier ones to have a chat with when you see him at the court's holiday party, that sort of thing. He's not the he's not always delivering angry speeches about you know, people angry on behalf of the Clintons and things like that. Sorry, I may just kind of have to duck this question because I don't have a really good word to describe each of the justices. I mean, I will say that, you know, some of them, so John Roberts, let me go to him. You know, he has, by necessity, had to become more aloof and standoffish in his role now, not just with reporters, but with the public at large. He says very little publicly. He doesn't go deliver a lot of doesn't go deliver speeches the way, say, Sam Alito recently did. He gave a speech to the Federalist Society that was very hard hitting about religious liberties and you know, I think when they joined the court, Roberts and Alito, you know, seemed like they were fairly similar in terms of the type of judges they had been on the lower court level. But because of their roles, Alito has become a little more of a bomb thrower, and Roberts has to be kind of the minimalist protector of the court as an institution. And I'll just mention two other justices because I think the contrast is really interesting. Sotomayor and Kagan, who ideologically aren't that far off from each other probably, but Kagan sort of took on the role of being more of a full-throated dissenter when she saw the conservative court doing something she disagreed with. Kagan was much more of a, I'm going to try to work with Roberts and Kennedy and maybe now Kavanaugh to try to maybe soften what they're doing and maybe work out a consensus kind of opinion. That may change now that Kagan has less ability to forge a kind of a middle coalition. So that didn't really answer the question, but that's a little bit of a flavor for the different personalities of the justices.
No, thank you for that. I appreciate it. We got another one from Israel. Can we talk more about Breyer potential retirement? What could be the judges that may replace him? Is that talk going around the halls of the court?
Well, I haven't been in the halls of the court since March. So, I mean, it's certainly, everybody is speculating about it. I don't know that anybody other than, you know, the justice and his wife and maybe his kids, you know, really know what he's thinking. The dynamic, I think, is this: with a 50-50 Senate, right now, Biden could be guaranteed of a vote on his nominee and, you know, almost certainly confirmation unless there's a big problem. If, you know, a senator dies, and, you know, isn't there, and suddenly it's 50-49 Republicans, or a senator dies and is replaced on an interim basis by a Republican governor, you know, the dynamic could change. So that is part of, I think, the urgency that some people are feeling for Breyer to retire. I would be very surprised if he does not retire in the next couple of years. You know, just because he is savvy enough to understand that 2 years from now we could have a very different Senate depending on how the election goes. Biden has said that he will nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court. And I take that to mean for the first opening, because who knows if he will get more than one. The names that have been bandied about, and, you know, this is not based on you know, any inside knowledge, it's you know, just names that are talked about a lot, include a judge who's now in the federal district court in Washington, Ketanji Brown Jackson, whose name came up for the seat that Merrick Garland was eventually nominated for. She could well be the nominee to succeed Merrick Garland on the DC circuit when he is, assuming he is confirmed to become Attorney General, which would let her be an appeals court judge. Another candidate is Leandra Kruger, who is a justice on the California Supreme Court. She spent a number of years in the Solicitor General's office, so she's very familiar with the U.S. Supreme Court. There's some other people as well. Names are mentioned. Both the two of them are fairly young. Jackson, I believe, is 50, and Kruger, I want to say, is maybe mid 40s. So they have the benefit from the Democratic standpoint of, they could potentially serve for a very long time. Obviously, the younger you are, there's also, you have a little more to overcome in terms of, seeming qualified for the position. So, there are pros and cons, but those are the two names I hear the most.
So yeah, it sounds like you have to kind of like plan for like who to expect for potential retirements and nominees. How do you go about that? And were there any surprises with Trump's picks, or did you kind of already have something ready to go when they were announced?
Well, so the Trump White House, in some respects, was the most transparent. I wasn't the one doing the reporting inside the Trump White House, but there wasn't a whole lot of mystery about the names of the people on the short list. That was actually pretty widely known. The first one, so when he picked Neil Gorsuch, there was, I think it is fair to say that most of the biggest Washington news organizations were 95% sure all day long, the day of the nomination, that it was going to be Neil Gorsuch. But because it was Trump, and because he, was so unpredictable, people just, you couldn't be assured that just because, the White House was telling everybody it's going to be Neil Gorsuch, that it actually was going to be Gorsuch. And, people had these visions of it being, like a reality show where he, brought Gorsuch and somebody else out there on, into the East Room of the White House, and, gave one of them the rose or something like that. And there was even it was crazy enough that, so the other judge who people thought, had it was on the short list, people thought a decent shot, was Tom Hardiman, who's on the federal appeals court based in Philadelphia. And I think it was CNN got some footage of him on the highway that day, gassing up, or off the highway, gassing up his car. And a reporter, I'm not sure if it was CNN or if it was a local reporter, but somebody was there asking him, "Are you going to Washington? Are you going to be nominated to the Supreme Court?" At the gas station. The Trump White House was just weird and different, and it depends on how closely administrations want to keep things to the vest. I mean, usually, I don't think any of the nominations that have happened since I've been covering the court has been a complete surprise. It's all been people who there was reporting that they were on the short list, or certainly they were, in the mix of people. And, my guess is, especially since he said he's going to nominate a Black woman, I wouldn't think that Biden would completely surprise us with a name we weren't at least thinking about.
I guess the question was, did you have stories kind of already written and you just have to hit like publish when the time came, or did you have to like really like wait until it was said?
Yeah, so I think it has depended. Back in the George W. Bush administration, I recall there was a team of us that had, when Roberts was nominated, we had at least little capsules on, at least a half a dozen people. That one was a little bit different because it was the first Supreme Court nomination in more than a decade. Now, the short answer will be, if there's we know there's it's down to 3 people. Yeah, we'll have stories on all 3 of those people. If we think there's one that is, 80% likely we'll spend a lot more time on that one than the other ones, but want to make sure that we're not totally caught off guard if it's one of the other two people. I mean, certainly I have, a Breyer retires, template, just like I, had a Thomas retires template and a Alito retires template prepared for the end of last term in case one of the two of them left. And, I don't have a Kavanaugh retires template or a Barrett retires template, but, at some point, I guess I probably will.
We'll be looking forward to reading those 3 when they happen. So we have a question from Rebecca about Justice Ginsburg. What kind of voice was lost when Justice Ginsburg died, and do you see another justice getting that kind of attention and respect she got?
Yes. So, she was, Roberts liked to describe her as a rock star. A lot of people like to describe her as a rock star. Unique among any justice I've covered, certainly. She drew 14,000 people to an arena in Little Rock. She represented something. It wasn't just what she wrote. It was in part what she wrote. It was, and almost, her, with rare exception, her most noteworthy opinions were dissenting opinions because she spent a lot of time on the court in the minority. But it was also just what she represented, what she overcame in her life. The fact that she was just one of a small number of people in her law school class, that she, repeatedly dealt with cancer, that she, was also a mother, that she, was 4 foot nothing, weighed nothing, and, yet was this, incredibly dynamic or, powerful figure. And worked incredible late hours. In terms of who kind of takes that spot, will take people, anybody a while, but Sotomayor is the obvious answer to that. When I talked about the difference between Sotomayor and Kagan, and by the way, I just read something today. If somebody's interested, a journalist named Irene Carmon wrote something about Justice Sotomayor in New York Magazine, I believe it was, I just read, just about how she is like kind of filling this void. When I talked about the difference between Kagan and Sotomayor, when Sotomayor would write those dissents, Ginsburg was often there with her. The two of them were the ones who were, writing the strongest dissent, saying, "Hey, what's going on here is wrong." She's sort of the obvious candidate, and she will bring her personal background to that as a Latina woman, and somebody who has overcome a lot of obstacles in her own life.
So we have a question about Ginsburg and Scalia's close friendship, despite their opposing views of law. Do you think that kind of friendship will exist again, given our politically divided environment?
Forgive me, I'm just checking one quick thing here. It was unique. So part of what happened with that, part of the reason they became such good friends is because they worked together beforehand. They developed that friendship when they were on the DC circuit together, where you just, by the nature of the work there, I mean, you can still have divisive cases, but there was a lot more working together, and so they developed a trust of each other in that context. And it's hard to, at least with this current group, it's hard to see that kind of ideological opposites becoming very close friends in that same way. You seen a few glimmers of it with Sotomayor and Gorsuch. They seem to get along pretty well. They sit next to each other on the bench, or they did when they were sitting next to each other, and you could just kind of tell that they would play off each other, even though they are just about at the two poles of the court. Certainly they are in some cases. You definitely see some mutual respect between Roberts and Kagan. I don't know that that's I'm pretty sure they're not going to the opera together, but they're, that is more because they are arguably the two justices, in the center of the court, or we're the two justices closest to the center of the court until the last changeover. There's only 9 people, so you can only have so many different kinds of relationships. So I think it'll be a while before we have anything quite like Scalia and Ginsburg.
Someone wants to know what's it like interacting with justices? Who's the best interview? Who's the most challenging to talk to?
So I alluded to this a little bit. I mean, they do a limited number of on-the-record interviews. There are some, you can have some interactions with them in other contexts. I did allude to the fact that, I find Justice Kavanaugh just an easy person to talk to, and part of that may be an age thing. He's we're roughly the same age. We can always slip off and talk about baseball because we're both baseball fans, and for me, some of the justices who have been around longer can be harder to get to know, because when I started covering the court, even though I've been doing it for a long time, these were justices who were kind of on Mount Olympus, and it wasn't as colloquial a relationship. Now, that being said, some people, like Justice Breyer, is actually a very colloquial guy. You almost wouldn't expect it because of, he lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He speaks French. He, surrounds himself by a lot of very sophisticated things, but he's also somebody who is very easy to talk to, and that comes across when he does do public appearances. And then some justices, John Roberts, although I knew him before he joined the Supreme Court, as I said, because of his role, I think this is really because of his role as chief, and as the person, he sees himself as a protector of the court's institutional reputation. He's just very tight-lipped about things. He does very, very few public appearances, and makes very few public statements, and you get the impression that when he does make them, he really thinks through what he's going to say. So, for example, when he put out that statement, forgotten if it was a couple years ago, but not horribly long ago, during the Trump administration, where when Trump was going after a district judge, calling, I think it was calling him an Obama judge, Roberts put out a statement saying, hey, we don't have Obama judges and Trump judges. We're just, we just have judges who are doing their level best to, apply the law. And that was the kind of thing that he really thought of before he said it, before he put it out. But he's not going to give an interview where he delves into, where you ask him a series of follow-up questions about that. When Ginsburg was alive, she did a ton of public appearances. She would do interviews with journalists. I interviewed her a couple times, once on camera. Probably nobody is going to do that many, although they do more interviews when they write books, which doesn't mean they make news in those interviews, but that's actually a good time to get a justice to at least say something, is after they've written a book and they're doing their little book tour.
Speaking of tight-lipped justices, Rebecca asked, what's the deal with Clarence Thomas? He doesn't seem to say much, even in opinions on cases. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, but people say that because he didn't ask questions at arguments. He would go years without asking questions at arguments, and his explanation was generally something like, he thinks that the arguments were too much of a free-for-all, that the lawyers need to have time to talk, and he clearly didn't like jumping in and interrupting somebody in the middle of an argument. So what they're doing with these pandemic arguments is they're asking questions in order. They're going one by one. And you know, I think some justices love this format and some of them hate it. It means that the Chief Justice asks the first set of questions, and then it's Justice Thomas's turn. He seems to love it. He is asking a lot of questions now. When it's his turn, on both sides, he uses pretty much his full amount of time, and is asking questions. And he's remarkably, given that he is such a conservative justice who has such really strong views about things like that the Constitution's establishment of religion clause shouldn't apply to the states. His questions don't let on that he is particularly ideological. They are often just very kind of technical, thoughtful, lawyerly kinds of questions. So there are multiple sides to him. He's also somebody who, in private settings, people around the court just talk about he's a great guy to talk to. He just likes to choose the right setting to talk.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit more about the new setting with the pandemic going on? So from what I understand, it's like audio streaming, and I also want to ask you this because I know you spoke to Harvard Law in 2015, and someone asked you about the courts ever being on TV, and you said you think that's going to happen. So do you think that this format now is going to stay, and will TV come closer now because of it?
I don't know if TV will come closer. It might. I think it'll be really hard for them to go back to not streaming the arguments after doing this. I think I'd be surprised if live streaming is not here to stay. And it may be, I mean, it's, we haven't heard any of the justices talk much about this format and their reaction to it. It may be that they are, at least some of them are saying, hey, we're streaming these arguments and it's not a problem at all. There's no reason why we can't then take the next step and do video, or at least be a little more open to it. It may be that in terms of like the way they do their questions, that they go back to the old format where they have it more of a free-for-all, or they may keep it like this, or they may have some sort of hybrid process. I don't know. There is a phenomenon in terms of just going back to the video where justices, when they are nominated, will often say something like, oh, I'd be, fine with video, but I would, want to talk to my new colleagues if I'm confirmed to the court, and, I'd want to listen to them, but I don't have any problem with it. And then they join the court, and I guess they've listened to their colleagues. They no longer seem so favorably disposed to it. And that is in part because the court as an institution doesn't like doing things. If one justice really, really objects to having cameras in the courtroom, the way Justice David Souter used to say, will happen over my dead body, the rest of them, their instinct is to defer and not to make a change that will make one of their colleagues really uncomfortable.
I see. I also wanted to ask you, just how has your job changed since the pandemic? I mean, has it been easier, harder? Do you prefer this format? Is it challenging? What are your thoughts?
So, I mean, it's less fun. I don't get to go in the courtroom. I mean, the arguments are fun, seeing them interact. The arguments are less entertaining. They're a lot less entertaining now, both because of the format that they use, the one after another, and just not being there in the laugh lines don't work as well if you're not in the same room with somebody and you don't have an audience, and you just have less interaction with the justices, either seeing them on the bench or otherwise, and you don't have the as a reporter covering the court now, I don't have any access that almost anybody else doesn't have. I get the opinions when they pop up on the website. I don't, before the pandemic, I get the opinions when somebody hands me a paper copy of them, which is usually you know, I don't know, a minute before they pop up on the website. And before the pandemic, if I'm covering an argument, the only people who see that argument or hear the argument are the people who are up there in the courtroom. So, you know, I get to come down and immediately tell a lot of people things that they weren't able to find out on their own because they didn't have access to the audio. And so all that's gone. And, you know, it is, I mean, sure, it's nice. There are some things that are easier about it. The streaming nature of arguments means I can, you know, record them. You know, I've got the app that creates an instant transcript, and I can, you know, more easily get exact quotes from justices quickly to put into stories. And yes, that's an advantage. And or go back and listen to that thing that I sort of missed when they said it, or to confirm that what I thought I heard, I really did hear. So there are some advantages to it, but you know, I will look forward to going back to the court whenever that happens.
And looking back at the decisions that were made during this time, there were some interesting ones about voting, religious services. I think recently they dismissed the emoluments clause one. Are there any of those that you find interesting, and can you talk a little bit more about them?
Emoluments probably wasn't that interesting because it just became moot when Trump stopped being president. Both sides agreed to that. You know, the one thing you mentioned, religious services, you know, we've had a lot of COVID related cases, and a lot of those have come up in as emergency applications. So what's usually the biggest news from the court are the cases that they hear arguments in, and they have a ton of briefing, and lawyers get to spend a ton of time, you know, really coming up with a well-developed brief, and they're usually pretty easy to understand. These emergency applications are things where, you know, the lower court decision is going to, you know, is in effect, and you want to have your service on Sunday, and you really want the Supreme Court to act quickly, so you're filing something, you know, you're slapping it together over the course of 48 hours, and the justices are acting really quickly, and whatever opinion they wrote, they write, you know, very quickly. And it's a little less coherent on all ends of it. So it is a little more challenging to cover some of those. You know, the cases that are easier and in some ways more satisfying to cover are the ones that you actually get to think about them for a while. So certainly had plenty of time to think about the Affordable Care Act case that the court heard arguments in November, and seemed like they were going to leave intact the bulk of that law. You know, it's a little bit of a weird Supreme Court term in that there aren't that many blockbuster cases in the ones that are being argued. In fact, after the Affordable Care Act case that probably goes downhill pretty quickly, there's one pretty potentially significant religious rights case that they also have heard arguments in previously. So it's I mean, and it's also just a term in transition. I mean, they're trying to figure out how they're going to operate with, it's a new group of 9 with Justice Barrett there. And so I think everybody is kind of, between that and the pandemic, they're kind of feeling their way along right now.
All right, so it looks like we have about 4 more minutes with you. So I'm going to make sure we have these quick questions done. So the first one I just want to ask about you personally. Have you always admired the Supreme Court and wanted to write about it? Like, how did you get to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a law degree, and I've always been interested in journalism. You know, so I was editor of my high school newspaper, and I basically just came out of law school, thought about becoming a lawyer, decided I didn't want to do it, and I wanted to cover legal. I wanted to try to bring the two things together and cover legal journalism. I started off for a year or so covering lower courts and the Justice Department, and then the Supreme Court beat opened up. I can't say I really thought exclusively about the Supreme Court until I started covering it, and then I found I really liked it. And then at some point, kind of got to the point that I'm not sure I could cover anything else because it's the Supreme Court's kind of a idiosyncratic beat where you spend a lot more time reading briefs and sorting through legalese and less time interviewing people and that sort of thing. So, it's now just kind of become what I do.
And then we want to ask, speaking of, we spoke about Obamacare being one of the cases you're looking for. Is there any other cases that you're looking for, or is that kind of just the one for in terms of blockbuster cases and stuff?
That is the biggest one. There's a patent case I care a lot about from a business standpoint. Sorry, patent copyright case between Google and Oracle, having to do with whether when Google created the operating system for the Android phones that it illegally used copyrighted programming code that is owned by Oracle. That one's pretty big. Honestly, the things I'm most interested in beyond that, in addition to whether Justice Breyer retires, are things like what are they going to do with this abortion case that I mentioned earlier? Are they going to take up a gun case? The agenda setting that we haven't seen yet is just going to be so crucial because when the court takes up a gun case, there's a really good chance they're going to be on the side of gun rights. And when they take up an abortion case, there's a really good chance they'll be on the side of allowing more restrictions on abortion. It's almost like the climax, the thing we're waiting for is not how the decision comes out, but what cases they'll take that will tell us, how far they want to go and how quickly. So I'm very eager to see what they do with this abortion case in particular. There aren't any gun cases that are quite ready for them to act on yet, but before the term is over, they'll have, I'm sure, multiple chances to say whether they're going to take up another Second Amendment case for next term.
All right, so I'm going to have one more question for you since we're hitting our hour. I really appreciate you being here, by the
Sure.
way. So this one's a fun one. It says, what would you rather do as a reporter? Cover a World Series game or do the exclusive interview with the new justice?
Oh, wow. But that's tough because I am a baseball fan. Maybe I'm not fun. I guess I have to say the new justice. I get, how could I tell my editor, yeah, I turned on the interview with the new justice because, the Cardinals were in the World Series and, I'm really excited about the Nolan Arenado acquisition. And, so yeah, I'd have to put the new justice.
One last question, actually, I meant to ask you, because I saw your tweet about it the day I invited you to speak with us. The Boston Marathon bombers on the court docket, no? Can you tell us more about that, what that's about?
Yeah, and that's one that could be sort of caught in between because the Trump administration is trying to reinstate the death sentence, or was trying to reinstate the death sentence. And the court didn't act before Biden became president. So now it's in a weird middle ground where I don't know. I mean, in theory, the Biden administration could withdraw the appeal. It could certainly signal that it doesn't want to pursue the death penalty anymore. It's hard to imagine the court would take up the case unless it is confident that the Biden administration wants to pursue the death penalty in this particular situation. So it's, like a lot of cases with the changeover in administration, it seems like maybe the court is just kind of waiting to see what, if there's some outside developments that let it know how it should handle a case.
Well, if they take it, we'll be watching since we're in Boston, and we'll be reading your report on it.
Yeah. All right.
All right, Greg, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time again. We really appreciate it. It's Greg Stohr, everyone from Bloomberg News.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Have a good night. Thank you. And thanks everyone for watching. I really appreciate it. You can find a recording on this if you go to SPJ New England on YouTube. You'll see a recording of this program from tonight and other programs we've had. So hope to see you there. And everyone, we have a program next week, so make sure you check out our Facebook page to find out more. And thanks again for tuning in. Appreciate it. Bye, guys. Thanks, Greg.
Take care.